A deposit appeared in my bank account on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in a meeting, and I didn't know it was going to change everything. The notification showed $400 from a name I did not recognize. 2 words, a first name and a last name, neither of which corresponded to anyone I had ever done business with or expected money from. I looked at it for 3 seconds, made a note to check it later. Returned my attention to the meeting because the meeting was not finished, but by the end of that day, everything had changed. Later that evening, I sat at my desk and looked at the deposit properly. $400. Monthly. That word appeared in the memo line. Rent, October. I do not own rental property. Or rather, I do own property. 1 apartment. Purchased 4 years earlier in a building 30 minutes from where my husband's family lived. We had bought it as an investment, the plan being to rent it eventually when the time was right, and we had found the right tenant through the proper process. We had not rented it yet. We had discussed renting it. We had not taken any steps toward renting it. I use that word carefully. Because there was a time when I would have said we without thinking about it. Before I understood what we really meant. Before I understood that my apartment, purchased in my name with my money, was somehow also their apartment, their asset, their opportunity. That time came to an end on that Tuesday. My in-laws, my husband James's parents, Edward and Patricia, had always had strong opinions about the apartment, not hostile opinions. That is important to say because this story is not about hostility. This is not a story about people who were cruel. They had enthusiastic opinions. The kind that arrive wrapped in helpfulness and are difficult to object to because objecting to helpfulness feels like you're rejecting kindness. It feels like you're being ungrateful. So you smile and you listen and you say thank you. From the month we purchased the apartment, Edward had suggestions. He knew a property management company, a good one, professional. He had a cousin who worked in real estate, a smart man, successful. He had thoughts about pricing, specific numbers. He had thoughts about tenant screening, red flags to watch for. He had thoughts about timing, when to list, when to wait. He presented these thoughts like someone who was giving a gift. Patricia had thoughts about staging. She had an eye for these things, she said. She offered twice to help furnish the space in ways that would maximize rental appeal, make it look lived in, make it look like someone already wanted to live there. She would know exactly what to do. Thanked them both. I said we were still deciding on the timeline. I said when we were ready to move forward, I would let them know. I said I appreciated their help and we would call on them when we needed them. This cycle happened 4 times over 2 years. 4 times. Their suggestions, enthusiastic, detailed, well-researched, my thanks. My statement that we were still deciding. Their acceptance followed 3 to 4 months later by the exact same conversation. What I had not fully understood during those 2 years of cycles was that Edward and Patricia had not been waiting for our timeline. They had not been standing by patient and hopeful for the day we would ask for their help. They had been developing their own timeline, their own plan, their own understanding of what the apartment was and what it should become. My attorneys. Name was Sandra Lee. I had retained her 3 years earlier for an unrelated contract matter and had kept her because she was thorough and direct, and had the specific quality of being completely unsurprised by things that other people found shocking. Nothing rattled her. Nothing made her lose her composure. She just listened, and then she explained what the law said. I told her about the deposit. She asked for the property address, the purchase documents, access to the apartment's utility account so she could check for any service changes that might indicate occupation. She called me back the following afternoon. She said, "There's a lease." She said it had been executed 6 weeks earlier, a 12-month residential agreement standard form. Monthly rent of $400. Tenant move-in date the 1st of the previous month. The landlord listed on the lease was not Edward or Patricia. It was me, my name, my contact information, my personal email address, which my in-laws had access to through a shared family account my husband had set up years ago for family communications. My signature, not my actual signature. A typed representation of my name in the signature field. The kind that appears when someone completes a digital lease form online and types their name rather than actually writing their signature with a pen. Sandra said, "They executed a lease in your name, using your identifying information, without your knowledge or consent." I sat with that for a moment, trying to make the words make sense. Sandra said, It's fraud. Executing a legal document in someone else's name without their authorization is fraud. The fact that you own the property doesn't change that. It actually makes it worse. I told my husband that evening, I want to be honest about how that conversation went because it matters to the story and because it matters to understanding who James is and what our marriage actually is. James and I have a good marriage. The kind built on communication that is genuine rather than performed. Communication that is honest even when honesty is inconvenient. Communication built on the specific trust that comes from years of being honest with each other, even when honesty requires admitting something uncomfortable. He had not known about the lease. I was certain of that before I told him and more certain after. His response had the specific quality of someone receiving genuinely new information rather than someone managing the delivery of something they already knew. He was quiet for a long time after I showed him the lease documentation. Then he said, "I'll call them." I said I appreciated that. I said Sandra would also be sending a letter and that I needed him to understand the letter was coming regardless of the family conversation because the legal matter and the family matter were separate and both needed to be addressed. He said he understood. The family conversation happened first. James, Edward, and Patricia on a Sunday afternoon at their house. I attended. I said very little because James handled it and handled it well, which I had trusted him to do from the beginning. Edward's explanation was the one I had expected. He said they had been trying to help. That was his framing. Trying to help. He said, the apartment was sitting empty and generating nothing. He said they had found a good tenant. A young professional. Reliable. Exactly what we would have wanted if we had been involved in the process, which we had not been. He said they had intended to tell us once it was settled because they did not want to involve us in the logistics. The details and complications of finding a tenant and executing a lease. They were simply taking care of it, for us, as a gift. James asked whose decision it had been to use Grace's name on the lease. Edward said it had seemed the simplest approach, since the property was in Grace's name anyway. Since she owned it. Since her name was already on the deed. Using her name on the lease seemed logical, efficient, simple. James said, "That is not how this works. That is not how any of this works." Sandra's letter went out Monday morning, 12 pages, the lease, the forged signature, the unauthorized use of my identifying information, the legal exposure Edward and Patricia had created for themselves and potentially for me. A clear statement of what was required to resolve the matter. The existing lease needed to be properly executed with my actual authorization, or terminated immediately. The tenant needed to be informed of the situation. All future decisions regarding the property required my express written consent. Nothing could happen to my apartment without my knowledge and my permission. The letter also noted that the $2,400 deposit currently sitting in my account would be treated as rental income and managed accordingly, and that any further deposits received would be held pending resolution. It outlined my rights as the property owner. It outlined their obligations under law. It was firm and professional and left no room for interpretation. Edward called James the evening the letter arrived. I was told it was a difficult call. Edward was not immediately receptive to the framing of what he had done, which I had fully anticipated. People who act from what they believe is helpfulness are often the last to understand why the person they were helping does not experience it that way. To Edward, he had solved a problem. He had found a tenant for an empty apartment. He had handled the paperwork. He had protected my interests by finding reliable income. To me, he had committed fraud and violated my autonomy and treated my property as if it belonged to him. These two understandings were not reconcilable through a phone conversation. It took 2 conversations between James and Edward, and a follow-up call from Sandra to Edward's own attorney before the matter was resolved clearly, completely, with no ambiguity remaining about who owned the apartment and who got to make decisions about it. The resolution came in increments. The lease was re-executed with my actual signature. I reviewed the lease properly before I signed it. I reviewed the tenant's application. I spoke with her directly. Her name was Sophie. She was exactly who I would have chosen if I had been involved in the process from the beginning, which made the whole situation both satisfying and frustrating simultaneously. I had been right that they would find a good tenant. That part was true, but that was never the point. The point was that it was my decision to make. The utilities were transferred properly from the previous arrangement. The rent payments were rerouted to an account I controlled directly. No more deposits coming to me with me having no idea where they originated. Edward and Patricia received a clear written statement from Sandra, outlining specifically what they could and could not do with respect to the property going forward. They could not contact the tenant directly. They could not make decisions about maintenance or repairs. They could not suggest improvements or changes. They could not involve themselves in the property in any way without my express written consent. Edward signed an acknowledgement of these terms. Patricia did not comment on this. She did not argue. She did not object. She simply did not comment, which was her way of conceding, which was her way of accepting that she no longer had a say in what happened to my apartment. The tenant, a woman named Sophie, has been in the apartment for 8 months now. She pays on time. She communicates clearly. She has mentioned twice that she would like to renew when the lease ends. I am inclined to let her. She seems like a good fit. More importantly, she respects the lease. She understands the boundaries. She honors the arrangement. My in-laws have not offered suggestions about the apartment since the letter arrived. This is a significant change in pattern. Before, they offered suggestions every 3 to 4 months without fail. Now there is silence. This silence is its own acknowledgement. This silence means they understand now. Or at least they understand enough to stop trying. I have chosen not to draw attention to this change in behavior. Sometimes the most productive thing in a family relationship is to let changed behavior be its own acknowledgement, to not press, to not require an apology or a conversation, to just let the new reality settle into place without interrogating it. James and I talk about the apartment sometimes. The way couples talk about shared investments, practically, with the specific shorthand of people who have been through something together and have come out on the other side knowing each other better. He said once, a few months after the resolution, that he was sorry it had happened, that he was sorry his parents had done that he understood how violating it was. I said I was glad it had happened in a certain way, not for the difficulty, not for the violation, for the clarity. We both knew now exactly what the apartment was. We both knew whose decisions governed it. We both knew what the process looked like when decisions needed to be made. We both knew that what was mine was actually mine. That protection of property is not something you negotiate. It is something you enforce. Some things are clearer after they have been tested. The apartment is one of them. My marriage is another. I learned something important during that experience. Documentation matters. Legal clarity matters. Understanding your rights matters. But most of all, understanding that you are allowed to own something completely. That you are allowed to make decisions that others disagree with. That you are allowed to say no to people you love. That took a lease being executed in my name without my permission to truly understand. My name is on the lease now. Properly. With my actual signature on a document I reviewed and authorized and understood completely, the way it should have been from the beginning, the way it will be from now on, and it will never again be taken from me, not without my knowledge, not without my consent, not without my voice. Because I understand now what documentation means. I understand what it means to have a record. I understand that my signature is my power, and I will never again let someone forge it.